and it is a new composite framework that we have designed to capture multidimensional mobility constraints in rural areas. So I would like to thank a couple of people who have been really fundamental to this research. First, starting with my supervisor, Dr. Rain Moses, but also Dr. Dego and Dr. Wang. So we've worked together to make this research project a reality. And I'm really excited for this opportunity to kind of share this work with you today, but not only share it, but also like get some feedback and insights from each and every one of you. So the RSeed's mission is to develop safe and efficient mobility solutions, specifically tailored to underserved rural communities. So the work that I'm presenting today directly supports this mission by offering a structured way to measure these rural mobility challenges. So this is just to give you a brief overview of how today's webinar presentation will go. So I'll start with the introduction, which gives an overview of the motivation for this study, as well as the problem. But then I will also go over some literature review that we did, and then I will also introduce the Rural Mobility Index and go through its key components. And then I will end with an optimization framework that we have proposed, together with some policy implications that come with this index. And finally, we'll have a session for question and answers. So before we go into our study, so I'd like everyone to, I'd like to have this icebreaker to kind of get everyone thinking about mobility challenges. So mobility can be defined as the ease with which individuals can move efficiently from one point to another, right? So when we think about mobility challenges in your own communities, what creates the biggest barrier to movement in your particular county or region? So could it be poor infrastructure, or is it long distances to transit stops or services? Or is it low service frequency of these transit buses? So just take a moment to reflect, and when you find what feels most pressing on your region, feel free to scan the QR code that you see on your screen. It will take you to a website where you can fill in some of your answers, and then we can review them. So I think I can give you a couple of minutes to scan that QR code, and then we can check on what we have.
Maybe, Sarah, you can put the scanning where page on the screen so that people can still keep it. Yeah. All right. You can also type it as a message. I see there is a message on the board. Yeah, you can type it however you want. Yeah.
Okay, so I think public transportation in our city and surrounding areas limited. Yeah, that's a good point. With most rural communities, especially areas that are like have sparse networks, sometimes there is not enough public transit to serve the people in those communities. So I think that's a good point. So anyone who is not able to scan the code, you can also just fill your answer in the chat while we're still reviewing the others that are filled through the code.
Or feel free to unmute yourself for like a minute, 30 seconds and say something if you. let's see what people think.
Okay, so we have infrastructure, distance and cost. Yeah, which are all like really good points, because all these three could be constraints when it comes to mobility in rural areas. When infrastructure is not up to like a particular standard, it's hard for people to move from one place to another. With distance, we talk about distance to like transit stops. So when someone has to move a long way, like has to walk or ride a bike or maybe even drive to like a particular transit stop, and the distance is too long, this is also like a challenge for our rural communities. But cost, of course, like travel costs for people who maybe are low income individuals, and the amount of money that they would have to spend on transportation would be too much, and so cost could also serve as a challenge, right? So when we look at some of these challenges that you have hinted on, we can go on to look into our program statement. So I wanted that icebreaker to kind of be like a segue into our problem, or what exactly motivated us to do this study. So with these challenges, including inadequate infrastructure or low service frequency or long distance transit, we realized that most mobility tools and indices were originally designed for urban contexts, or these people who designed such indices had urban environments in mind. So, but rural areas operate under a completely different set of constraints, right? So we often see these issues here. And because of this, many transportation metrics may fail to accurately describe mobility in rural settings, right? So this gap is what motivated the development of this rural mobility index. So if we look into this table, it just kind of gives like the differences between transportation in urban and rural contexts. So when it comes to transit availability, for instance, with urban areas, public transit exists, but sometimes it could be overcrowded and strained by demand due to large populations. But on rural contexts, on the other hand, public transit is limited, right? Or it could be absent completely. And this is due to the populations being dispersed. When we look into infrastructure conditions with urban areas, the infrastructure is often overused, and this leads to maybe frequent repairs, while for rural contexts, we have these sparse networks, so maintenance is a bit difficult. But we can also look into other categories like travel distance, where in urban contexts, people have shorter trips, but sometimes could be delayed by congestion, while in rural areas, on the other hand, people have longer travel distances between essential destinations. So these kind of differences just kind of is just to kind of show you how these two contexts differ in terms of the challenges that people face in regards to mobility. So obviously, even when it comes to like deciding on measures for such mobility, there should be a difference, right? On the right side of the slide, you can see some statistics which highlight how different the transportation environment really is. So it's kind of like to solidify what is presented on the table, right? So we can see here that only 20% of Americans live in rural areas, yet those areas contain 68% of the nation's land miles. Also, urban areas have about 1,000 lane miles per 100,000 residents, while rural areas have about 9,000 lane miles per 100,000 residents. So even though the population in rural areas is smaller, the infrastructure is much more spread out. So meaning this provides providing frequent and reliable public transit becomes a bit more challenging for rural contexts. So these structural differences are what make rural mobility fundamentally different from urban mobility. And that's why we need metrics that reflect rural realities rather than urban assumptions. When we look into the next slide, this chart shows two important differences. It's from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, and this shows the more differences between rural and urban households. So on the left, you can see how rural residents travel significantly more miles across every income group. And that's because essential destinations like work, healthcare, and groceries are farther apart in rural areas. But on the right, we see that the rural households also spend a bit more higher share of their after-tax income on transportation. So they're traveling more and paying more for it. So this combination of longer distances and higher cost burden is a key reason why rural mobility challenges can't be evaluated using urban-based metrics. So it also explains why economic burden is one of the core components of our rural mobility index, which we're going to see in a little while. So before we go deeper into the index, I want to pause for a bit and bring the focus to the people behind those numbers that we've just seen. So we've talked about long distances, limited service coverage, low frequency transit, right? But these challenges don't impact everyone equally. So here's a quick reflection question. So who do you think faces the greatest mobility barriers in rural areas? So is it older adults? Is it individuals without access to a vehicle? Or is it low-income households? So whatever comes to mind, you can also scan this QR code as well, and we can look into the different ideas that the audience has on this matter. So we'll just take a moment and think about which groups in your area struggle the most to go where they need to go. So I feel like including this is important because it's insightful to see the different range of perspective across different communities. So I think we can take a couple of seconds just to fill that out as well.
Feel free to scan or type your comments also. Either way works.
Yeah, I see a comment already. Someone mentioned the elderly and low-income households, which of course there is no wrong or right answer. These are all groups that are affected by mobility challenges, but I think we just want to see depending on the area that you're from, which group is particularly more affected by this. So you can keep bringing the answers. You can keep having the answers coming in. Okay, so we see that elderly residents has been mentioned by most of you. And yeah, so this is something that we observe in our communities, and we can see that the elderly people are most affected, and it's really difficult for them to move easily from one point to another due to these different challenges that we've talked about. But also, someone also mentioned students, which could also be true. Maybe for students, especially for students who perhaps maybe live far from where classes and stuff like that. So there are so many different groups of individuals that are affected when it comes to mobility. So this just kind of enforces the need to find a solution to these mobility challenges. So after that reflection, we can go ahead and proceed to look into our rural mobility index. So we did conduct a literature review. So we examined existing mobility metrics that have been used in transportation research. And we realized that many of them focus on accessibility or gravity-based measures or travel impedance, but these work well when it comes to dense networks, and they rely on assumptions that don't really translate to rural areas. So we can see, for instance, there was a metric called the Rural Access Index that was developed by the World Bank back in 2003. And the way it works is it measures the percent of population that lives near all-weather roads, which is a good metric, but the limitation for this is it ignores some certain factors like frequency, affordability, and service functionality, right? We also have another index that was proposed in the year 2011 called the Composite Transit Index. So this combines route coverage, frequency, and service hours, but it does not have cost or behavior inputs. Or for instance, we have the mobility equity metric, which considers cost, mode choice, and service spread, but it's not particularly calibrated for rural conditions. So when we looked at all these limitations, we tried to think of how we can come up with a metric that would kind of address each of these limitations and make the index a bit more tailored to these rural contexts. So this is where the Rural Mobility Index comes in. So to address these gaps, we introduced this index, which is a composite measure, which reflects mobility through a rural lens, right? So it has 4 critical dimensions. We have the economic burden part, which addresses the gap in previous literature in which they had no affordability measure. So we have this component for economic burden. We also have the service coverage, which addresses the limitation in which there was no focus on physical access to services. We have the third component, which is distance to transit, which expresses how far people have to travel in order to access a bus stop. And lastly, we have the last component, which is transit service frequency. So most of the metrics ignored, like how frequent people in a particular area have access to a bus, right? So together, these 4 components describe affordability, availability, and reliability of mobility in one number. So this slide shows how we derived the structure of the index. So it builds on an index from urban literature, but it integrates rural-specific dynamics. So on the left, we have a typical urban index formula, and on the right is the proposed rural mobility index, which introduces some parameters, including distance decay, frequency adjustment, and the economic burden component. So since rural mobility is multidimensional, there is no single factor that fully captures mobility constraints, right? So when we have a mathematical framework that combines all these components together, it allows us to kind of integrate cost, distance, service availability, and frequency into one consistent measure. So just to explain how each of these parameters were obtained, just briefly. So the first component is the economic burden function. So like I said, rural households often spend a larger share of their income on transportation. So this is due to dependency on personal vehicles and long distance to travel. So we measure the cost relative to income in order to capture affordability constraints. So we introduce the C/I, which is the cost to income ratio, which represents how much of an individual's income is actually spent on transportation. So as shown in the figure here, we can see that the economic burden function decreases with increase in cost to income ratios. So we can see that the steepest decline is observed for personal vehicles, which reflects that they have a higher cost burden, especially in low income rural households where car dependency is common, right? So bus and bicycle modes impose a relatively lower burden and decline a bit more gradually, while walking remains constant across all ratios as it imposes no direct financial cost. But we also include a parameter, which is the cost sensitivity parameter. So this explains how quickly mobility declines as the cost burden increases. So this parameter is fine-tuned in a way that reflects world real world trade-offs, and prioritizes mobility improvements for users that are most sensitive to cost. So this is the first component of our index, the economic burden function. The second one is the distance to transit stops. So accessing a bus stop or mobility service often requires long walks, right, in rural areas. So we compute the real world travel distance between like where someone lives, their residential address, and the nearest bus stop that they have access to. So this function captures how distance to transit affects mobility, right? And we can see the different variables where we have the distance from where the individual is to the nearest transit access point, which is the bus stop. We also have a decay parameter, which determines how steeply the mobility decreases with increasing distance. And this term is mode specific and applies only to a bus because distance to transit stops is pertinent to the use of the bus. So here we can just see like kind of the process that we walked through in obtaining this distance to transit stops. So on this, on the left, we can see that we have a map of Leon County. So we obtained transit stop data from the general transit feed specification, so GTFS data sets, and residential address locations were also acquired from Open Address Database. So we each residential address was routed to its nearest stop using OpenStreetMap based street networks, and we computed the median of all the resulting distances, and that was the value that was used as the distance to transit. So that was the second component, but we also have the third component of our RMI, which is the transit service frequency. So even if services exist in rural communities, the low frequency can effectively limit mobility. So this component measures how often buses operate based on the transit feeds specification data. So this adjustment that we propose, it penalizes low frequency systems that reduce the practical usability of transit. So this is the third component. And the last one is the service coverage. So service coverage measures the percentage of the population or area within an acceptable distance of a transit route or stop. So in rural counties or communities, coverage tends to be sparse. So this makes this a highly influential factor. So one of the methods that help to visualize this coverage is by the use of isochrones. So an isochron is a geographic boundary that represents the reachable area within a given time or distance using a specific mode of transportation. So it shows how far someone can travel within a set time. So the figure here on the right shows a 10-minute isochron that was generated in an area in Tallahassee, and we can see all the bus stops that can be accessed within that 10-minute travel time. So this is how we compute the service coverage component of our index. And this is just an illustration of reachable services under different modes. So the previous diagram showed for one particular mode, but if you have more than one mode, it emphasizes the disparity in spatial reach, right? So you can see that with walking and biking, which are the first two on the top, you have limited areas that can be covered in rural settings. So transit falls somewhere in between, depending on stop location and frequency. But with a car, you can see that there are more services that can be reached within the same amount of travel time using a car as compared to other modes. So this analysis kind of shows how different modes expand or restrict service reach. So it reinforces why each mode needs to be weighted appropriately. So just to walk through some of the data sources that we use to compute each component. So we included the general transit feed specification data, like I mentioned, also some demographic data that was used to estimate the median household income and population distribution was obtained from the US Census Bureau. But to obtain transportation cost data, we used AAA's report, which helped us to determine vehicle ownership and operating costs. We also used TomTom maps, which helped us to obtain the points of interest data, which would help identify essential service locations. Also, we have Open Route Service for generating the isochrones, which helped us to generate these travel times for each particular mode. We also have Open Addresses Database for the residential addresses data for distance to transit computation, OpenStreetMap, and Tiger or line shape files, which gave us geospatial boundary data for each county that was used in the analysis. So after seeing how the Rural Mobility Index is and its various components, we then go on to the case study that we used. And we applied this index to 6 different counties in Florida that represent a full spectrum of conditions, from highly urbanized counties like Miami and Orange County to counties that are kind of suburban like Leon and Alachua County, and finally to rural counties like Gadsden and Jefferson. So these counties were selected really intentionally in order to capture different spatial forms, different income levels, and different transit environments. So we wanted to see, we wanted to use this diversity to kind of test how sensitive the index is across different contexts. So in order to see whether it can be meaningful and if it can distinguish between urban and rural mobility challenges. So on applying the different components of the index to each of these counties, we can see that we have some results on the table here. And the index shows a clear urban-rural gradient in mobility scores. So when we look at our urban counties, such as Miami-Dade and Orange County, they achieved the highest RMI scores, while rural counties like Gadsden and Jefferson, which are the last 2 rows here, recorded the lowest scores. And the counties that are somewhere in between, like Leon and Alachua County, fell in between, and this reflects their blend of like urban and rural characteristics. So this, the results that we obtained kind of aligned with what we would expect depending on the nature of these counties. But on looking on the particular modes, we can see that driving dominates mobility in all counties, while public transit contributes minimally due to infrequent service and longer access distances. But other than just looking at the results, we had to validate our index by comparing it against a ground truth mobility measure. And the ground truth measure that we used was the average travel times from the residential clusters to the nearest level 1 or 2 trauma center. So we compared the index to this ground truth, but we also compared our index to a traditional gravity-based Hansen index, which is like the state of the art, right? So in order to validate this, we use a Spearman correlation because it measures the strength of rank order relationships rather than assuming a linear relationship. So this makes it ideal for comparing mobility indices with real world outcomes, like the trauma center travel times that I just mentioned, whose relationships may be nonlinear or influenced by outliers. So when we look at the results that we obtained, the Spearman's correlation was 0.77 for the RMI versus 0.54 for the traditional Hansen-based index, which shows the RMI's stronger alignment with observed mobility barriers. But we also use visualizations to kind of see how well our index performed compared to the state of the art as well. And we can see that from this graph on the vertical axis, we have the travel times to those trauma centers, which is our ground truth measure. And the RMI shown in blue, the blue line, has a much stronger relationship with travel time, with a Spearman correlation of 0.77, as I mentioned before, while the Hansen index performs noticeably a bit weaker compared to our index with the Spearman correlation value of 0.54. So this tells us that the index captures rural mobility constraints a bit more accurately, especially in counties which have long distances, sparse networks, and limited transit coverage. So in other words, the index reflects rural realities that the traditional index tends to miss. So now that we've seen all these components of the RMI and all the results of our analysis, I would like to pause again for a moment of reflection. So if your region could invest in one category, right? So from these parts that I mentioned, meaning frequency, coverage, distance, or cost reduction, which one would you choose? Like, which one would you prioritize? So I thought to include this question because it kind of, it's the exact kind of decision making that our index is intended to support, right? So you can also scan that QR code and fill in your opinions on this question. So based on the 4 components of the RMI that I mentioned, which one would you prioritize if you were to choose one of them? Okay, I see frequency. Okay, so which means increasing the number of trips that the buses make in a particular area, which is a good intervention, I believe, since most of the rural areas, like we've seen before, like even though they have bus stops, sometimes they don't have the frequency that would enable people to efficiently move from one place to another. So frequency, we keep waiting on other answers as well. Okay, so we see frequency mentioned again. So
And
far
there
it's
you have one coverage on the
coverage
chart.
in the chat,
I
and
think-
there's coverage here as well. So
I think people are equally divided between cost reduction, frequency, and coverage. I think 2 poles per each, I believe. Frequency is gaining more.
Yeah, I see more frequency votes. So it seems frequency is probably the most critical challenge that most people would prefer to deal with, which is interesting to see. So when it comes to prioritizing improvements, we kind of thought of introducing an optimization framework that I am going to introduce here on the next slide. So building upon our index, we developed a simple optimization model to kind of explore how different investments can improve rural mobility, right? So in the previous question that I asked, we were looking into how we can prioritize one of those 4 components, but what if there was a way where we can improve all 4 of them while maximizing the total mobility, but also staying within a constraint, which is obviously a budget constraint, right? So this model that we prioritize, we developed here kind of shows that the objective function is, of course, to maximize mobility across all locations. But then this model considers trade-off among multiple components, right? So for example, whether improving frequency or reducing costs yields a greater mobility gain. So this is not meant to replace policy decision-making, but rather to guide and inform us using quantifiable data. So this is probably going to be like the next step of our research work. We haven't started working on it yet, but we would like to see how we could like propose different interventions for each of these 4 components and see how we can optimize and maximize the overall mobility in our rural locations, right? So these are the decision variables that we proposed. and each one corresponds to one of the components of our index. So for instance, for distance to transit, we could introduce an investment in reducing the distance to transit stops. So this could be maybe by construction of sidewalks, for instance, or when we look into the costs component, we could introduce fare subsidies for reduction in transportation costs. So these decision variables correspond to each of these components of our index. And of course, we have different constraints, including a budget constraint and a constraint for each of these decision variables that we have. So this is something that we're looking into in the future of our work, where we're going to be able to have a model that will be used as a tool by different transportation agencies as a way of how to maximize mobility in our different locations. So this slide highlights the key policy implications that emerge from our Rural Mobility Index results. So on the left, we see that we have scenario analysis. So our RMI can be used as a planning tool to test what-if policies or what-if scenarios, such as adding a new route or improving frequency or adjusting service coverage. So this allows agencies to kind of simulate changes before investing resources, right? So it kind of makes planning more proactive and data-driven. But also we have interventions here in the center. So counties with the lowest RMI scores can be flagged as priority areas, right? So these are communities that would be facing the greatest barriers and where targeted investments will have the biggest impact. And on the right, we have efficiency. So by identifying which components of mobility are driving the lowest scores, the RMI helps agencies to allocate resources more strategically, right? So this kind of supports the RCID's mission to advance safe and efficient transportation solutions in our rural communities. So from all this, we can see that the index doesn't just measure mobility, but it guides smarter decisions on where and how to intervene. So yeah, so this is basically part of the research that I've been working on. And like I said, I'm very grateful to my professor, Dr. Moses, Dr. Dego, and Dr. Wang for us working together to achieve these results. It's still a work in progress, but I believe that it would support some of the goals that RCID has when it comes to achieving some solutions for these rural communities that are underserved. So thank you for listening. And I would now like to invite any thoughts, any questions, any discussions. So this could be like a platform to kind of share ideas into. You can also like let me know if there is something you think we could include to make our model better. Anything that could be helpful, to this research would be greatly appreciated. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. It was really amazing presentation. And now is the time for question and answer. And so however you like, you can type, you will still have time for question and answer. Comments, you can still type, or you can even unmute. We prefer unmuting and having a discussion with us.
Oh, I see some chats here. Oh, thank you. Thank you for good comments. Yeah, I'm also very grateful for having the RCID Center. Obviously, I feel like it's a good forum for us to kind of like generate different ideas, such as this research. So I'm really grateful for all of you. Yeah.
And we would like also to note that these results and research has been accepted at the TRB annual meeting presentation. So I see there is a lot of transportation guys in the call right now. So come and have a discussion with us during that presentation. And I'd like to congratulate Sarah for the acceptance also. So until they think some questions, maybe I can ask you some questions, Sarah. So when it comes to a county level transportation policy makers, how do you expect policymakers to use your index here in a practical way? How do you envision it could be used?
So I think our index can be used as more from a diagnostic tool. So by breaking down mobility into like measurable components, right? Like frequency, cost, agencies can kind of prioritize interventions more strategically. So for instance, if the RMI hints at distance to transit being the major constraint in these areas, so the agencies could focus on maybe, expanding coverage or adding bus stops, right? The same way if, for instance, maybe the economic burden proves to be the biggest constraint in our index, obviously the agencies will know that, oh, maybe we have to focus on reducing costs by introducing maybe fair subsidies. So I feel like our index does not just tell us whether mobility is good or bad, but it also tells us why, right? So it basically helps these agencies to know where to focus on when it comes to trying to fix the situation.
Again, thank you. I think you have some comments in the chats.
Yeah. Could you please share details on the location and time of presentation at TRB? I think the presentation will be on the 12th of January. I would have to confirm this.
Okay, maybe you can email that.
Confirm, yeah. So
yeah. And do we have any more questions? Or I have a lot of questions. I can ask you more, but let's see. Let's give the chance to the audience. Either you can type it or unmute yourself. I see we have a lot of transportation guys in the call. So my next question would be, until they think, if let's say that this metric is it time sensitive? Or if you want to, let's say that if you want to update your metrics, or if there is available data, how would you go about it? If there is new data, new metric, or do you have to update it annually? When they are using, how do you suggest it will go?
Okay, so I feel like our index is designed to be like reproducible, like with publicly available data sets. So it would absolutely be able to be updated. So I would think that maybe annual updates would probably involve perhaps refreshing maybe general transit feed data, like to update frequency and coverage, but also maybe rerunning the routing engine to update distances to transit, recomputing the standardized component scores. So there are many different ways that would allow updating these scores. And I believe that the way the index is structured, it is very possible to to update it based on updates in available data. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. And you have something in the comment, you can read it and answer.
About scenario analysis, I am glad you included that in policy implications, especially relocation and expansion of resources of interest in this case. Yeah, so in the long run, we really hope that our index would become a tool that could be used by policymakers and these transportation agencies in solving challenges in rural communities. So yeah, we believe that even with implications such as scenario analysis, this could be this could come to reality, right? So yeah, I feel like it's a good point that you mentioned here, that scenario analysis would be essential, like especially for relocation and expansion of resources. Yeah. So it's just one of the ways in which we can kind of use our index to, guide our interventions in these rural communities. So thank you, Philip, for the insight. Could you please provide more details on open addresses database and POI data? Oh, so the open addresses database, it's a tool that allows you to kind of download. So you can download JSON files that provide you with these residential addresses. So you can either obtain data for residential addresses or for street addresses. So it gives you like different geospatial data. And I think it was open source. Yeah, it's open source. So once you just create an account, you can easily access all this data with just one click. And we process the data using mostly Python. And with POI data, the points of interest, we used a TomTom API. So we're able to generate an API using TomTom, and it gave us access to these points of interest for our counties of analysis. So yeah, but I believe there are so many other tools that could be used as well, but I feel like these were like easy to reach for us because they're, open source data. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions before I jump to ask another one? So here is my another ambitious question. If this is a ground transportation metric, right? So is there a chance that you can expand it to more? For example, I know that in areas like in Washington State, they use a lot of water transportation. So can this be expanded? If it was to be expanded, how would you do it? I know this is ambitious, very far, but then again, if people like rural area or a lot of these places where they kind of live in swampy areas, they use ferry, freight transportation, that kind of to move the agricultural products or logistics. Is there a way that this could be expanded to include such kind of transportation?
Yeah, I think the framework is flexible, but to expand it to maybe freight movement, I feel like some of the components would have to be redefined. So maybe like instead of coverage and distance, we would probably have like components that are a bit tweaked. So maybe we would have to include stuff like maybe travel time variability, or with freight, maybe we'll look at access to these points of, processing facilities. So I think it's possible, but we will need to translate some of our metrics in a way that like matters to these particular other areas. Although it's something that something to look into like way in the future, because as of now, obviously we've just focused into like transportation, like yeah. So, but I believe that it's possible.
Okay, that's nice. And thank you. Yeah, and I will give the chance to other people to ask. We have a couple of minutes. If you have any comments, question, you can just unmute yourself and have discussion with Sarah. You have a comment, I believe, or a question in the
For
chat.
the Florida, okay. For the Florida County case study, what metrics did you use to define the rural county? Okay, so we mostly used population, of course. Areas that had like counties that had lower population in comparison to other counties. But apart from population, we also looked at like the median income, but mostly population was used to define these rural counties. And also we had to look into like how the population distribution and the population density was. So for the areas that, because you could have a high population or a low population, but if the population is like closely clustered, that would most likely not be a rural county. So we had to like map these addresses or these these points to actually see how spread out the population is in order to like determine whether this area is urban or not.
That's interesting. So we know Gadsden County and Jefferson County are both rural areas, right? Everyone agrees. But then again, is there a metric? I've seen a lot of people ask this question, a metric that could clearly differentiate between urban and rural. I'm not sure about that. Maybe you can tell us, do you know any metric that differentiate between urban and rural? Emmanuel, Iman, think Emal Timan. I don't know the name. Maybe you can tell us if you know any metric that can help. If you plug in the values, it tells you whether it's urban or rural. Yeah. But I've seen that discussion in a couple of times where people are doing research to differentiate between urban and rural.
Yeah.
But for now, I think Sarah used a clearly understood counties that are rural counties like Jefferson and Gadsden County, which are labeled as rural county in the state of Florida.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are some counties where, like you mentioned, like for Gadsden and Jefferson, where it's pretty obvious. But I do understand the need to like specify
Yes.
what measure. So yeah, so thank you for mentioning that. So it's something that we would have to look into as well.
Also specify why you chose or based on what. Yeah. It's a good
Yeah,
point.
that would be necessary, of course, because we also plan to kind of extend this work to like other counties, not just the ones that we used. So yeah, this is important to note.
Yeah. Any more questions, comments? We are almost reaching the hour, and if you don't have any more questions, Sarah, do you have anything to say, or we could end the webinar?
Well, yeah, I'm really grateful for everyone who was able to join us today to kind of see like part of our research that we're doing as part of the RSeed Center. So yeah, we're going to obviously present this at the TRB conference. So all the points that you provided, all the insights were very useful and appreciated. And it will also help towards that, the preparation for that presentation as well. So thank you all for joining today. Yeah, I guess that's all.
All right. Thank you all for the attendance. Thank you, Sarah, for this amazing presentation, for the research, and all the PIs and collaborators in this one. We thank the RSeed Center for the funding, the research collaboration, and all the other RSeed consortiums across the United States. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We're ending the meeting. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.